The air at the Miller Farm auction hung thick and heavy, a humid August cocktail of diesel exhaust, stale coffee, and the sweet, cloying smell of financial desperation. Elias Thorne stood near the back of the crowd, his arms crossed over his chest, his knuckles scarred and permanently stained with the ghost of hydraulic fluid. He watched the proceedings with a quiet, practiced stillness, his gaze sweeping over the tired faces of his neighbors, men who were selling off pieces of their lives, one rusty implement at a time. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Henderson with a sweat-stained straw hat, was working his way through the smaller items. Wrenches that had turned 1,000,000 bolts, greasy funnels, log chains that had pulled countless stumps. Each item sold for a pittance, another small nail in the coffin of a family farm. Elias didn't bid. He was here for one thing, a silent, hulking beast that sat apart from the rest of the machinery, looking like a beached whale in the tall grass. It was a Massey Ferguson 760 Combine. Not just any 760, but a late model one, a monster of a machine from the mid-70s. It should have been the prize of the auction, the kind of iron that would have farmers bidding with their hearts instead of their heads. But this one was broken. Not just broken, but mortally wounded. Word was it had thrown a rod clean through the side of the big Perkins V8 diesel. The main auger was bent into a sad, crooked smile from hitting a rock culvert, and the whole machine was coated in a film of dried, blackened oil from the catastrophic failure. It was scrap. Everyone knew it. "All right, folks, let's move on to the big ticket item," Henderson bellowed, his voice cracking through the old PA system, "or what's left of it." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd. "We got here a Massey Ferguson 760 Combine. As you can see, she's had a bad day. A very bad day. Engines locked up tighter than a banker's fist on Friday afternoon. We're selling it as is. Where is? Good for parts. Good for scrap. What am I bid to haul this big red paperweight away?" Silence. The only sound was the buzzing of flies and the distant rumble of a tractor working a far-off field. "Don't be shy now," Henderson pleaded. "The tires alone are worth something. Let's start the bidding at $500. Do I hear 500? More silence. Men shuffled their feet, looking down at the ground, at their worn-out boots, anywhere but at the dead machine. $500 was a lot of money to haul away someone else's problem. A loud, arrogant voice cut through the quiet. "I'll give you 100 for it, Henderson, if you throw in a cutting torch and a case of beer." The crowd turned. It was Dale Bishop. He was leaning against the fender of his brand-new, gleaming black Chevrolet Cheyenne, a smug grin on his face. Bishop was the new king of the county. He'd inherited a good piece of ground and, instead of farming it the old way, had gone straight to the bank and leveraged it for everything he could get. He leased 2 brand-new International Harvester 14N80 axial flow combines, tractors with air-conditioned cabs and radios, and was buying up land from struggling farmers like the Millers. He saw debt not as a danger, but as a tool, and he looked down on men like Elias as dinosaurs. Henderson forced a smile. "Very funny, Dale. We all know you only drive red. Now I need a serious bid." "Do I hear 300? $300 to get this thing off the property?" Elias remained still, his face an unreadable mask. He knew that machine. He'd seen it run. The power of the Perkins V8, the sheer volume of grain it could swallow. He'd seen the inside of its engine manual once, studied the diagrams. It was complicated, a world away from the simple, bulletproof 6-cylinder diesel in his old John Deere 4020, but the principles were the same. Steel, iron, compression, and fire. 200! Can I get 200? Henderson was getting desperate. Elias thought of his own combine, a John Deere 45. It was a good machine, reliable as a sunrise, but it was small. Harvesting his own acreage took weeks. He had to pass on custom work because he just couldn't cover the ground fast enough. He was debt-free, a fact that gave him a quiet pride, but also limited his horizons. Every dollar he spent was a dollar he had earned and saved. He had no line of credit, no friendly banker to float him a loan. His wealth was in his land, his tools, and the knowledge in his head. "All right, one last time?" Henderson sighed, wiping his brow. $100. "Do I hear 100? Dale Bishop laughed again. "Just call the scrapper, Henderson. It's worth more by the pound." That was it. That was the moment. The condescension in Bishop's voice, the dismissal of a fine piece of engineering as worthless junk. It lit a slow burning fire in Elias's gut. He unfolded his arms. 200, Elias said. His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear and steady, cutting through the humid air like a cold chisel. Every head snapped in his direction. A low murmur went through the crowd. Elias Thorne? Bidding on that wreck? He was the man who still used a Farmall M for chores, who rebuilt his own injectors, who could make a 40-year-old tractor run like new. But this was different. This wasn't a repair, it was a resurrection. Henderson's eyes lit up. "I got 200 from Elias Thorne. Do I hear 250? 250? He looked directly at Dale Bishop. Bishop just shook his head, a look of pitying amusement on his face. "Let the old fool have it. He'll need something to tinker with all winter when the rest of us are counting our money. 200 going once," Henderson called. "Going twice." Elias met Bishop's gaze across the crowd. There was no anger in Elias's eyes, only a calm, quiet determination. He knew what they were all thinking, that he was a stubborn relic, a man clinging to the past while the world moved on. Let them think it. "Sold!" Henderson's gavel cracked like a rifle shot. "For $200 to Elias Thorne. Good luck to you, Elias. You're gonna need it." As the crowd dispersed, shaking their heads and whispering, Elias walked toward his prize. He laid a hand on the massive rear tire, feeling the sun-baked rubber. He looked up at the cab, the faded Massey Ferguson logo, the shattered engine bay. He could smell the disaster, the acrid scent of burnt oil, the metallic tang of stressed steel. To everyone else, this was the end of the line for a great machine. For Elias, it was the beginning. Now, before we get into the grease and the grit of what Elias was about to attempt, I have to ask you folks listening. Have you ever taken on a project everyone said was impossible? A machine everyone else called scrap, a car left for dead in a field, a tractor that was supposed to be a parts donor. Let me know down in the comments what it was and how it turned out. Because what Elias did next, with nothing but his own 2 hands and a shed full of old tools, was something the whole county would talk about for years. Getting the dead combine home was a battle of inches. It was 10 miles from the Miller place to his own. 10 miles of narrow county blacktop and gravel roads. The 760, dead weight, was over 12 tons. His largest tractor, the John Deere 4020, was a powerhouse in its own right, but this was a different class of heavy. He started by unbolting the big 20-foot grain header, a tangled mess of bent sickle bars and twisted sheet metal. He chained it to the bucket of his 4020 and dragged it home first, the steel screeching on the pavement, leaving a trail of sparks and gouges that would have the county road commissioner furious. It took him half a day. For the main body of the combine, he needed more. He drove his old Farmall M, the one his father had bought new in 1948, back to the auction site. Bolted to the back of the farm wall was a heavy-duty winch he'd salvaged from an old logging truck. It was slow, powered by the tractor's PTO, but it was strong. He spent the rest of the day carefully winching the combine's front axle up, inch by agonizing inch, until he could back his heaviest wagon chassis underneath it, blocking it up with solid oak timbers. It was a dangerous, nerve-wracking process. One slip of a chain, one cracked timber, and the whole thing would come crashing down. The tow home was a slow-motion parade of pure mechanical strain. The 40C20 was in front, its diesel engine roaring under the load, the exhaust stack puffing black smoke with every turn of the tires. The wagon chassis groaned, its tires flattened almost to the rims. Elias had the Farmall M chained to the back of the combine, acting as a brake and a rudder on the downhill slopes. He drove the 4020, his senses on high alert, feeling every shudder, listening to every creak of the chains. Dale Bishop flew by in his pickup, slowing just long enough to honk his horn and give Elias a sarcastic thumbs up before peeling out in a shower of gravel. Elias ignored him. His focus was absolute. He felt like a captain steering a crippled battleship into port. By the time he finally pulled the mechanical carcass into his own yard, night had fallen. He was covered in grease, sweat, and dirt, his muscles aching with a fatigue so deep it felt like it was in his bones. His wife, Sarah, brought him a glass of iced tea, her face etched with worry. "Elias, are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice soft. $200 isn't much, but the parts, the time. He took a long drink, the cold tea a blessing on his parched throat. "It's good iron, Sarah," he said, looking at the dark shape of the combine against the stars. "It's just hurt. I can fix it." She knew that look in his eye. It was the same look he'd had when he rebuilt the engine on the 4020 a decade ago. The same look he had when he re-roofed the barn by himself. It was a look of quiet, unshakable resolve. She nodded, trusting him even when she didn't understand. The next morning, the real work began. His workshop was his sanctuary. It wasn't a modern pole barn like Bishop's, but an old hip-roofed barn with massive hand-hewn beams. Inside, everything had its place. The walls were lined with tools, many of them belonging to his father and grandfather. There was a heavy-duty press he'd built himself, a lathe, a drill press, and an ancient, massive anvil that had seen a century of use. The air smelled of cold steel, oil, and hard work. He started the teardown. The first task was to get a look at the heart of the beast. The Perkins V8 was crammed into the engine bay, a maze of fuel lines, hydraulic hoses, and wiring. He spent 2 days just disconnecting everything, carefully labeling each hose and wire with a piece of masking tape and a grease pencil. He used his engine hoist, a heavy A-frame on casters that he'd fabricated from scrap I-beams, to lift the engine free. The moment the block swung clear of the chassis, he felt a small thrill of victory. He wrestled the engine onto a heavy-duty stand. The hole in the side of the block was ugly, a jagged, fist-sized crater of shattered cast iron. He pulled the oil pan. The bottom was a sludge of metallic shavings and chunks of what used to be a piston and connecting rod. It was worse than he'd thought. For the next week, he meticulously disassembled the engine, piece by piece. He laid out each part in order on his workbench. The crankshaft was scored beyond repair. 3 of the 8-cylinder sleeves were badly damaged, deep gouges torn into their walls. The camshaft was likely bent from the sudden, violent stop. Most mechanics would have declared the block unsalvageable. But Elias wasn't most mechanics. He spent an evening with a micrometer and a dial bore gauge, measuring every critical surface, comparing his readings to the specs in the thick service manual he'd ordered. The block itself, the main structure, was sound. The damage, while catastrophic, was contained. The search for parts became an obsession. He couldn't just walk into the local Massey dealer. They'd laugh him out of the place and try to sell him a new machine. He started calling salvage yards, working his way across the Midwest with a rotary phone and a notepad. He found a crankshaft in a yard in Nebraska, pulled from a combine that had burned. He drove 8 hours to inspect it himself, measuring the journals with his own micrometers before handing over the cash. He found a set of used pistons and rods in Missouri. The cylinder sleeves were another problem. New ones were prohibitively expensive. So he decided to make his own. He bought a length of high-grade ductile iron pipe with the correct inside diameter and spent 2 weeks on his old metal lathe, painstakingly machining it down. The work was precise, demanding. He'd take off 1/1000th of an inch, stop, measure, and repeat. The curled slivers of hot metal falling to the floor. While waiting for parts, he turned his attention to the bent auger. He couldn't just bend it back. The metal would be weak. He cut out the damaged section with his cutting torch. Then, using the forge his grandfather had built, he heated and hammered a new piece of heavy-gauge steel to the correct shape, welding it into place with a skill born of 1,000 other repairs. He ground the weld smooth, and when he was done, the auger was stronger than it had been from the factory. All winter, the lights in his workshop burned late into the night. The sounds of grinding steel, the hiss of the welder, and the clang of a hammer on the anvil became the soundtrack of his life. Neighbors would slow down as they drove by, seeing the silhouette of the massive combine looming in the yard and the single light glowing in the barn, and they'd shake their heads. "Stubborn old thorn," they'd say, still trying to polish that turd. The boom years arrived like a sudden spring rain after a long drought. It was the mid-1970s, and the world was hungry for American grain. Prices for corn and soybeans shot into the stratosphere. For the first time in a generation, it felt like a farmer could actually get rich. The mood in the county turned from cautious pessimism to unbridled optimism overnight. No one embodied this new era more than Dale Bishop. The high grain prices and easy credit turned him from a local hotshot into a regional tycoon. He bought the Miller farm, then the old Henderson place next to it. His holdings swelled to over 2,000 acres. He traded in his already new International Harvester tractors for the latest models, the big 1466 and 1566 black stripe tractors, their turbocharged engines a constant roar across the countryside. He built a new house, a sprawling brick ranch style that looked out of place among the traditional white farmhouses. His wife drove a new Cadillac. He was the poster boy for modern farming. The farm journals wrote articles about him, praising his aggressive expansion and his embrace of new technology. He talked a new language, a language of cash flow, depreciation, and leverage. At the grain elevator, he'd hold court, slapping backs and talking about the new 4-wheel drive Steiger he was thinking of buying. "You can't be scared of debt, boys," he'd preach, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Debt is a tool. Land values are only going one way, up. You borrow against that equity, buy more land, and your net worth explodes. It's simple math." He'd often glance over at Elias, who would be quietly waiting his turn to unload his grain. "Some people," Bishop would say with a smirk, "are just content to stay small. No vision." Elias never said a word. He just nodded, collected his payment slip, and went home. He was doing well too. Very well. The second winter after he'd bought the Massey, he had finally finished the engine. He'd sleeved the block, installed the new crank, and painstakingly reassembled the entire V8. The day he first turned the key was a moment he'd never forget. The starter motor strained for a moment against the fresh, tight tolerances of the rebuild, and then the big diesel coughed to life, sputtering black smoke before settling into a deep, rumbling idle. that vibrated through the concrete floor of his workshop. It was the sound of victory. That fall he took his first harvest with the Resurrected Massey Ferguson 760. The machine was a revelation. It could harvest more in a single afternoon than his old John Deere 45 could in 2 days. The cab was relatively quiet, the controls smooth. He felt a deep satisfaction, the feeling of a craftsman using a tool he had not just repaired, but reborn. With the grain boom in full swing, his services were in high demand. Smaller farmers who couldn't afford the sky-high rates charged by custom operators like Dale Bishop were eager to hire Elias. He worked from sunup to sundown, his big red combine a familiar sight, chewing its way through fields all over the county. The money was good, better than he had ever seen. But unlike Bishop, Elias didn't spend it. He and Sarah still lived in the same modest farmhouse his parents had lived in. He still drove his 15-year-old Ford F-100 pickup, its fenders showing the first signs of rust. The profits from his custom work and his own crops didn't go into new trucks or bigger houses. He paid cash for his fuel and his seed. He bought a few more acres from an elderly neighbor who was retiring, paying for it outright from his savings. The rest of the money went into the bank, into savings bonds and certificates of deposit. His discipline was seen as a weakness. At the coffee shop, the other farmers would talk. "Can you believe Elias Thorne?" they'd say. "Making money, hand over fist with that old junker combine of his, and he won't even buy himself a decent pickup. He must be burying it in coffee cans in the backyard." They saw his thrift as fear, his lack of debt as a lack of ambition. In an era of explosive growth and easy credit, the man who owed nothing to anyone was an outcast, a failure by the new definition of success. One afternoon, the banker from Farmers Trust, a young man named Peterson with slicked back hair and a suit that looked too expensive for a small town, paid Elias a visit. He pulled up in a shiny Buick, stepping carefully around the chickens pecking in the drive. "Elias, good to see you," Peterson said, extending a soft hand. "Just wanted to stop by and see if you were ready to join the modern age." Elias wiped his greasy hands on a rag. "What can I do for you, Mr. Peterson?" "I see the numbers, Elias. You're sitting on a pile of cash. It's not working for you in that savings account. Inflation is eating it alive. We could leverage that. Get you a line of credit to buy that quarter section next to you that's coming up for sale. Land is the best investment on earth. They're not making any more of it, you know." Elias looked past the banker, out at his fields of maturing soybeans, the leaves shimmering in the late summer sun. He thought of Dale Bishop's ever-expanding empire, built on a mountain of banknotes. He thought of the whispers in town, the pitying looks. For a moment, he felt a pang of doubt. Maybe they were right. Maybe he was a fool, a relic from a bygone era, too cautious for his own good. Then he looked at his workshop, at the big Massey combine sitting inside, its red paint gleaming under the single light bulb. He had wrested that machine from the scrap heap with his own 2 hands. It owed him nothing, and he owed nothing for it. Every dollar it earned was his. It was a feeling of freedom, of solid, unshakable security that no line of credit could ever buy. He turned back to the banker and gave him a polite, firm smile. "Thanks for the offer, Mr. Peterson," he said, "but I think I'll just stick with what I've got. I sleep pretty well at night." The banker's smile tightened. He shrugged, got back in his fancy car, and drove away. That evening, as Elias was cleaning up in the shop, a news report came on the small transistor radio he kept on his workbench. The announcer's voice was grim, talking about interest rates, about the Federal Reserve, about a man named Paul Volcker. He spoke of inflation hitting double digits, of a prime lending rate that was climbing higher and higher, with no end in sight. Elias shut off the radio. A cold knot formed in the pit of his stomach. He looked out the open barn door. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. It was beautiful, but it felt like the calm before a storm. The good times, he sensed, had been too good, and for men who had built their kingdoms on borrowed money, a day of reckoning was coming. The first sign of trouble wasn't on the radio or in the banker's ledger. It was in the sky. The summer of 1980 arrived hot and breathless, and then it stayed. The rain simply stopped. Day after day, a relentless sun baked the fields, the corn leaves curling inward, a desperate, thirsty prayer. The creeks dwindled to muddy trickles, and the ponds on the back pastures shrank, their edges cracking into intricate, geometric patterns of dried mud. For Elias, the drought was a hardship. His yields would be down, no question, but his costs were low. He tilled his own ground, planted seed he'd paid for with cash, and his fuel bill was his biggest expense. He watched the sky with a farmer's practiced worry, but not with panic. For Dale Bishop, the drought was a catastrophe. His entire operation was a high-wire act of leverage and cash flow. He needed massive yields to service his massive debt. With 2,000 acres of thirsty corn, he was burning through thousands of dollars a week in diesel fuel, running enormous irrigation pumps day and night, trying to cheat the weather. The roar of his big tractor engines never ceased, a constant, expensive growl of desperation hanging over the valley. The second sign of trouble came during the harvest. The corn that survived was stunted, the ears small. It was a race to get it out of the field before the dry stalks became too brittle. One afternoon, one of Bishop's two gleaming International Harvester, 1480, combines ground to a halt in the middle of a field. A plume of hydraulic fluid misted into the air, shimmering in the dusty sunlight, before the machine went silent. The problem was a failed main hydrostatic pump, a complex and catastrophically expensive part, buried deep in the machine's guts. It wasn't something a farmer could fix with a wrench and a pry bar. Bishop had to call the dealer in the city, 2 hours away. The service truck took a day to arrive. The mechanic, a young kid who looked like he'd never seen a dirt road, spent hours with diagnostic gauges and a service manual as thick as a phone book. Elias saw it all. He was harvesting a small field he'd rented right across the road. His own Massey, the Resurrected 760, rumbled along steadily, its big Perkins V8 never missing a beat. He'd had his own breakdown a week earlier. A bearing had gone out on the main feeder house chain. He'd heard the telltale squeal, shut the machine down immediately, and spent 4 hours in his workshop, pressing out the old bearing and installing a new one from the stock he kept on a shelf. He was back in the field by lunchtime. His total cost was $17. Bishop's repair took 3 days, 3 crucial harvest days lost. The final bill for the part, the labor, and the service call was over $5,000. Elias heard the figure later at the grain elevator. Bishop paid it with a check that looked like it pained him to sign. The arrogance was gone from his face, replaced by a tight, brittle stress. The confident king was beginning to look like a man besieged. The cracks in his empire began to show. He was late paying his bill at the fuel co-op. He traded his wife's Cadillac for a more sensible Chevrolet. The talk at the coffee shop changed. The awe in their voices was replaced by whispers, by speculation. How much did he owe? Could he make the payments with corn prices falling and yields crippled by the drought? The world Bishop had built, a world of ever-increasing land values and limitless credit, was beginning to crumble at the edges. His new, modern machines, once symbols of his untouchable success, were revealing themselves to be liabilities. Their complexity a gilded cage. He was dependent on the dealer, on the bank, on a global grain market he couldn't control, and on weather that refused to cooperate. Elias, meanwhile, just kept working. He finished his own harvest, and then started on his custom work. His rates were fair, his work was meticulous, and his old Massey was reliable as a sunrise. When a small part on the unloading auger gearbox broke, he didn't order a new one. He took the broken pieces into his workshop, fired up the forge, and welded them back together, reinforcing the joint with a piece of plate steel. He ground it smooth, painted it, and put it back on. It was stronger than the original. One evening, Sarah found him sitting on the porch steps, long after the sun had gone down, just looking out at the darkness. The only light was the distant, lonely glow of Bishop's yard lights, illuminating a silent, sprawling farmstead. "You're worried about him, aren't you?" she asked softly. Elias nodded slowly, not taking his eyes off the distant lights. "He flew too close to the sun, Sarah," he said, his voice quiet. "And now the wax is melting." He felt no satisfaction, no sense of vindication, only a profound and weary sadness for a neighbor caught in a trap of his own making. The storm he had sensed on the radio all those months ago was no longer on the horizon. It was here. The final collapse came not with a bang, but with a series of registered letters from the bank. The prime interest rate, which had been a manageable 7% when Dale Bishop signed his biggest loans, had screamed past 20%. The variable rate clauses in his contracts, once an afterthought, were now a guillotine. His monthly payments had nearly tripled. At the exact moment his income had been halved by the drought and plummeting commodity prices. Land values, the bedrock of his entire financial strategy, cratered. The acres he had bought for $3,000 were suddenly worth less than $1,500, but the bank was still owed the full $3,000, plus the crushing interest. The friendly banker, Mr. Peterson, stopped visiting. His calls became curt, demanding. The foreclosure notices went up on a cold, grey morning in November. They were nailed to the fence posts at the end of Bishop's long gravel driveway, the stark, official text, a public declaration of failure. The county sheriff served the papers. The auction was scheduled for the first Saturday in March. The news spread through the county like a winter sickness. It was one thing for a small farmer like Old Man Miller to go under. It was another thing entirely for Dale Bishop, the man who was supposed to be the future, the one who had done everything the experts and the farm magazines had told him to do. If he could fail, anyone could. A wave of fear washed over the community. Elias saw the notices on his way into town. He pulled his old pickup over and just stared at them for a long time, the paper fluttering in the cold wind. He thought of Bishop's smug grin at the Miller auction, the casual cruelty in his voice. But the memory brought no comfort. All he felt was a hollow ache in his chest. The winter was grim. Farm after farm went under. Auction bills were tacked to the bulletin board at the co-op and the post office. The coffee shop was quiet, the conversations hushed and somber. Men who had been neighbors for generations now avoided eye contact, ashamed of their own struggles, fearful of the future. Through it all, Elias's farm was an island of stability. He had no debt. The money he had saved during the boom years was still in the bank, earning interest. He had enough to see him through this downturn, and the next one after that. His frugality, once a subject of local mockery, was now his fortress. Other farmers, desperate to keep their own equipment running, but unable to afford the dealer's prices, started showing up at his workshop. A neighbor needed a hydraulic cylinder, rebuilt on his old case tractor. Another needed a gearbox, welded on his corn planter. Elias never turned anyone away. He'd charge them only for the parts, if he had to buy any, and a few dollars for his time. Often, he'd accept payment in the form of a dozen eggs, a side of bacon, or just a heartfelt handshake. He was fixing more than just machinery. He was mending the frayed edges of a community coming apart at the seams. He saw Dale Bishop only once that winter. He was at the hardware store buying bolts. Bishop came in, looking gaunt and haunted. His expensive work coat was stained and torn. He was buying a single pane of glass to fix a broken window in his house. He paid with a handful of wrinkled bills and loose change. Their eyes met for a moment across the aisle. Elias saw no fight left in the man, only a profound, bottomless exhaustion. He nodded a greeting. Bishop just stared back, his face a blank mask of shame, before turning and walking out without a word. Elias's survival was quiet, unceremonious. It wasn't a victory he celebrated, but a responsibility he shouldered. His old iron, the John Deere 4020, the Farmall M, and especially the big Massey Combine, were more than just machines. They were proof of a different way. They were debt-free, repairable, and understandable. In a world of complex finance and disposable technology, they were symbols of a tangible, durable, and self-reliant strength. While the modern world he had rejected was collapsing around him, his own small, carefully tended world held firm. The day of the Bishop auction dawned cold and overcast, a fitting sky for a funeral. The long lane leading to the farm was choked with pickups and cars. The crowd was huge, larger even than at the Miller sale, but the mood was vastly different. There was no idle chatter, no laughter. People spoke in hushed tones, their faces grim. They were here not just to witness a neighbor's downfall, but to stare into a mirror of their own deepest fears. Elias parked his truck down the road and walked in. He stood at the back of the crowd, just as he had before, his arms crossed over his chest. The scene was a haunting echo of that day years ago. Bishop's magnificent machinery, once so gleaming and proud, was lined up in a neat funereal row. The two International Harvester 1480 combines, the massive Steiger four-wheel drive tractor, the fleet of Black Stripe Internationals. They looked like dinosaurs awaiting extinction, their value dissolving in the cold March air. The auctioneer, the same Henderson from the Miller sale, looked older, wearier. His rapid-fire patter lacked its usual energy. He knew these were not just machines he was selling. They were the pieces of a man's broken dream. The bidding was sluggish, the prices heartbreakingly low. A tractor Bishop had paid $80,000 for just a few years earlier, sold for $20,000. The combines went for pennies on the dollar, bought by large corporate farm operations from out of state. Elias watched it all, a silent observer. He didn't bid. He wasn't here to pick over the bones of another man's failure. Then, near the end of the sale, they brought out a smaller tractor. It was an old Farmall 560, its red paint faded and peeling, its tires cracked with age. It was clearly out of place among the modern giants. Henderson cleared his throat. "All right, folks, this here was Dale's father's tractor, the one he learned to drive on." A stillness fell over the crowd. Dale Bishop was standing near the house, his wife beside him, her arm linked through his. He was staring at the old Farmall, his face ashen. This wasn't just another piece of iron. This was his history, his connection to the father who had built the farm he was now losing. The bidding started low. $1,000, $1,200. It stalled at $1,500. Dale closed his eyes, unable to watch. Elias unfolded his arms. He thought of his own father's Farmall M, sitting safe in his shed. He thought of the tools on his wall, passed down through generations. He understood what that tractor meant. It wasn't about money. $2,000, Elias said. His voice was calm and clear, carrying across the silent yard. Heads turned. Henderson's eyes found him. I have 2,000 from Elias Thorne. He looked around. No one else moved. Sold, Henderson said, his gavel falling with a soft, final thud. Later, after the crowd had thinned and the buyers were arranging to haul away their purchases, Elias found Dale Bishop standing alone by the empty fuel tanks. He looked like a ghost on his own land. Elias walked up to him and held out a set of keys. They were the keys to the old farm hall 560. Bishop stared at them, confused. "What's this?" "They're yours," Elias said simply. "Every man ought to have his father's tractor." Dale looked from the keys to Elias's face, his eyes filling with tears for the first time that day. The wall of shame and pride he had hidden behind for months finally crumbled. "Why?" he choked out, his voice thick with emotion. "After everything, the way I treated you." Elias looked out at the fields, the same fields he had looked at for his entire life. "Because we're neighbors, Dale," he said. "That's got to mean something. It's all we've got left when everything else is gone." He pressed the keys into Dale's hand, gave his shoulder a brief, firm squeeze, and walked away without another word. It wasn't a transaction. It was an act of grace. It was the quiet, final vindication of his entire way of life. True wealth wasn't in the size of your land or the newness of your equipment, but in the strength of your character and the depth of your compassion. In the years that followed, the story of Elias Thorne and the Bishop auction became a piece of local folklore. The farm crisis slowly receded, leaving deep scars on the landscape and the community. Some farmers, like Dale Bishop, managed to hang on, starting over small, humbled and wiser. Dale and his wife rented a small house in town, and he took a job driving a truck for the co-op. He and Elias never became close friends, but a quiet, profound respect grew between them. Whenever their paths crossed, they would nod, a shared understanding passing between the two men who had stood on opposite sides of a painful history. Elias's farm prospered. He never expanded into an empire, but he bought a few more pieces of land, always with cash, always from neighbors who were retiring and wanted to see their land stay in good hands. He became an elder statesman in the county, a man whose advice was sought and whose opinion was valued. The farmers who had once dismissed him as a relic now saw him as a prophet. They saw the wisdom in his cautious ways, the genius in his self-reliance. He kept the Massey Ferguson at 760, running long after others like it had been sent to the scrapyard. It was a local landmark. People would point it out as it worked the fields in the fall, its red paint faded by the sun, its engine still rumbling with the deep, powerful rhythm of the heart Elias had given it. One crisp autumn afternoon, when Elias was well into his 60s, his grandson, a boy of 10 named Samuel, was with him in the workshop. The big combine was in the barn for its annual maintenance. Elias was showing the boy how to adjust the tension on a drive chain. "Grandpa," Samuel asked, his small hands covered in grease, "why do you keep fixing this old thing? Dad says you could buy a brand new one and not even notice the money." Elias stopped his work and looked at the boy. He wiped his hands on a clean rag and knelt down, so they were eye to eye. "Samuel," he began, his voice gentle, "there are two kinds of value in this world. There's the price of a thing, and there's the worth of a thing. This combine. Its price was $200 and a lot of hard work. But its worth." He paused, gesturing around the workshop, at the tools, at the land visible through the open door. "Its worth is this farm. It's the freedom of not owing any man a single dime. It's the knowledge in your own two hands. A new machine has a price tag. This one has a story." He placed his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Never forget that, son. Don't ever be afraid of a little rust or a broken part. The things you can understand, the things you can fix, they'll never let you down. That's your real inheritance. Not the land, not the money. The knowledge. That's the part that lasts. Samuel looked from his grandfather's weathered face to the massive, silent machine. For the first time, he didn't see an old piece of junk. He saw a legend. He saw a story of struggle, of skill, and of quiet triumph. He saw the heart of his family's legacy, built not on credit or chance, but on the solid, unshakable foundation of good iron, hard work, and a wisdom that knew the difference between what something costs and what it is truly worth.